Warning: this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on today's episode, where you will learn how to dissolve division, taking a deep dive into consciousness and cosmology. My first guest is Paul Selig. Paul Selig is considered to be one of the foremost spiritual channels working today. Born in New York City, Paul received his master's degree from Yale. In 1978, a spiritual experience left him clairvoyant. Paul offers channeled workshops internationally and serves on the faculty of the Omega Institute, the Kripalu Center, and the Esalen Institute. Also a noted educator, he served on the faculty of NYU for more than 25 years. And he's channeled several books. He's been on the show before talking about some of his books, but the newest one is entitled Alchemy, a channeled text, the Beyond the Known Trilogy, Book 2. Welcome back, Paul. Thanks for joining me again on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Talk a little bit about your experience. You and I spoke before we began the interview about sort of the conventional educational path that you took and then the shift that happened in your own life. And I'd love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about the story.
Well, I was raised in mostly in New York City, and, we didn't believe in anything. It was, a very sort of comfortable kind of atheism, that I existed in. And when I was about 25 years old, I'd had a list of things that I thought I needed to achieve in the world. And I got the whole list, and it was a fancy list, and I thought that list would make me okay, and I wasn't okay. It was really simple and out of sheer necessity, not because I thought it would be nice to get a spiritual life. I began to open up to something more. I had a couple of experiences early on. This was 1987, so I was 25. And, really, I began praying for the first time in my life, and not because, I don't know why I did it. And I ended up hearing a voice in response to that, and my life changed. I got some guidance and I listened to it. And that was the beginning of this whole process that's, gone on for the last 33 years. I didn't expect to channel. I wasn't somebody who even necessarily believed in it. None of this was convenient to me or my life. I had a master's from Yale. I was, teaching college at NYU and running a graduate program for many years at a small college in New England called Goddard. And I was doing this work very quietly. For the most part, I wasn't looking to be known for it. I had a group that met in my apartment once a week where I would sit and I would channel. But initially, it wasn't the kind of work that I do now. Now I lecture and channel. The guys that I work with just come through me and speak, entire books at this point. But it was this thing that I did privately. And, finally what happened was these books started coming out, and I couldn't pretend anymore that I wasn't doing this. I would show up at NYU and my students knew what I did on the side. And there was nobody complained about it, which was nice. People were rather accepting of this strange ability that I seemed to have stumbled into. But finally, I just left about 5 years ago. So I was an academic for 25 years. And I enjoyed every minute of it, really. I loved teaching, and I loved the classroom, and I was good at it. And what happened with me in this work was the work directed me more than anything else. None of it was planned. It still isn't planned. And I just have this very odd ability to operate kind of as a radio, which is what I do. I'm a radio for the guides I work with. I turn the station and they come through and they do what they're going to do. And I work as a psychic. And when I work as a psychic, I'm tuning into the people that come to me. So if I were to tune into you, I would feel what it was like to be you, and then I would hear what's going on and have to sort of work with that information. I can do it with other people as well. So if you're not talking to your sister and you give me your sister's name, I can step into your sister and start to look like your sister and hear her as well. It's an odd ability. I don't know how it happened. Truthfully, I just feel at some point like my energy system must have been rigged up to do this work. And that's it. So it's been an interesting passage and one that is still ongoing. I don't feel like an expert at what I do. What I do is I just show up for it, often when I don't want to. And I've done that for a long, long, long time now. I just continue to show up because I'm so interested in what this stuff is. It's fascinating to me.
Well, it's fascinating to me as well. And you're very humble in your approach and your acceptance of what this is. But for many who are listening, they might think, what? Yeah. Like, what? What is this? I don't blame them. And, on the surface, like when you just sort of hear the facts part, you go, okay, well, that's just really interesting. But tell me more is what comes to mind next. Like the process of alchemy, when we just distill that word, the main title of the latest book, the transformation of matter. Mm-hmm. This too is part of the message that comes through you as well. Yeah.
Well, the guides have been delivering books through me since 2009. So alchemy, I think, was the 8th book that they've dictated. They've already completed the 9th here on Maui, where I am. It takes them about a month of lecture time. It can be spread out over 2 or 3 months. It used to be I'd work every day and the whole book would be done in 2 weeks. But when this process began, the guides delivered a book called I Am the Word. And it was unplanned. The guide said, we have a book to write, and if you take 2 weeks, we'll do it. And because I don't write my books, I sit in a chair with my eyes closed and speak them and record them, and the recordings are transcribed. That was the process. It took 2.5 weeks. I took 2 days off to go teach at NYU. Otherwise, it would have been a sequential 14-day process, I think. Anyway, they talked about the realization of the inherent divine in humanity, that there's an aspect in all of us, they call it the true self, who knows who he, she, it is, and seeks realization as in through us at the cost of who and what we think we are, which they say is somewhat misguided. We've overly identified with the personality structure, the idea of who we are, which is basically from a crude experience and upbringing and, culture. And the process of the books have all been about the manifestation of the inherent divine in form, which is an alchemical act. It's becoming the true self. And it's an energetic operation, for lack of a better word, and it's quite palpable. And that's what's so interesting about these books. The guides say the books work on 2 levels. There are the words on the page, which provide an intellectual context, and then there's the real book, which is the energetic transmission, which works directly on the reader. And when the first book was published in 2010, and there was no fanfare, there was no publicist, there was nothing. The book just got out there, and people began to pick it up. And the reviews started coming in on Amazon, and people were saying, I'm reading this book and my body is vibrating, and I'm reading this book and I'm seeing auras. And it's been that way in an ongoing way since for all of the books, because the books are all these energetic transmissions that are often quite palpable for people. But they're really supporting us in a reclamation of our inherent divinity. And that's what they're teaching. And the book Alchemy, which is actually... right now, it's my favorite of the books that they've dictated, only because it was a brutal process of delivering it. It was a very hard period when this was coming through, because my own life was being turned inside out. And that's kind of what happens with this book. I mean, this is the book that's the equivalent of emptying your pockets and letting all the lint fall out. It's going to happen if you read this. At one point, they describe it as sort of being held upside down by your feet and shaken. It's not, I mean, in some ways, it's a gentle process, but in some ways, the stuff that we hold on to that stands in the way of our realization of who we are in a higher way has to be addressed in order for that process to go on. I mean, I'm not very woo-woo, it's not really my thing.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah, I'm a bad New Ager. I think a lot of, I don't know. But I do think that the idea of an individual having his or her own experience with this work, which is what I care about, is valuable, because I don't want people deferring to me. I could care less. It's the last thing I really want, but I'm happy to take the dictation and let the work itself sort of be the proof of the worth of the teaching.
So you are the spiritual scribe, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's it. Or I mean, I think of it as, people sometimes say, "Oh, I want to be a chattel." I go, "Why would you want to do this?" It's really, in some ways, like being the court stenographer. It's not very glorious. I mean, the experience of it's fascinating to feel the energy run through you. I'm told that when I channel, my eyes turn bright blue. I mean, I've been hearing it for years. I think somebody's probably filmed it. I actually started hearing people had filmed it, because it was up online. But, all of this stuff, I find it enormously fascinating. But the process of channeling is about stepping into the back seat of the car and giving the wheel over and allowing this thing to come through without editorializing or fixing. Like, the rule for these books has always been, I don't get to go back and edit. So the books are the unedited transcripts. And if you could think of it, 8, 9 books now that have been spoken into being and then transcribed without editing. Maybe 3 words in a book might get changed, and it's usually because I mispronounced them when I was speaking them, or I didn't know the words, so I did my best sound alike, and then it becomes very apparent, what the intent was. But that's 3 books out of however many thousands and thousands of words.
That is astonishing, actually. And I think that this speaks to something that we all have elements of what you describe within us, but we push it away, you know? And I think that from what I have learned from you and the books that have come through you is this need for this deeper listening.
I like the term deeper listening. I think it's accurate. The guides I work with say this small self, which is the personality self, thinks, and the true self knows. And, what they're describing is a psychic ability called claircognizance, true knowing, inner knowing. And I do know that we all have access to that, but we're not living in a culture that invites us to trust that. Women in the past, I think, have had an easier time. They've been allowed to have their intuitive natures, Men, it's a little tougher sometimes, I think. But we all have it, but we don't trust it. We don't align to it. And we're too busy, I think, looking outside of ourselves for the evidence of what should be, to confirm some idea of ourselves, that we miss the truth of it.
And when we talk about sort of the moving beyond those limited interpretations of self, I mean, up until now, most of us are taught, well, we have a body, we have a mind, we have a life that we are leading. Mm-hmm. Some of us have a greater choice or hand in that life than others. And that's it, right? That's only what is the tangible. And from your work, what I glean and what this is telling me is that we have to move beyond. We don't have to, but we can choose to move beyond that interpretation, which opens up a completely different realm of beauty, of satisfaction, of love, of acceptance. The Christ consciousness, if you will, without being religious about it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the terms they use to describe it. I mean, they say that we're operating in an octave, a collective octave, a collective field with high notes and low notes. And they say every song can be sung in a higher octave into infinity. And what they're doing with us is basically transposing the music that we are, the vibration, the tone of our being, to operate in what they call the upper room or the higher octave, which is a simple way for me to understand, the passage. But to operate at that level of consciousness, I think, comes at great cost, which is who I think I am and who I decide other people are or should be. The guides I work with, they keep it pretty simple, but they say things like, you can't be the light and hold another in darkness. And that's a very challenging teaching, but it's very true. The light doesn't get to decide what it shines upon. And if we're going to express at that level, we have work to do, with our own fear and our own judgment and all those things.
Let's take a quick pause. And when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with Paul Selig. We're talking about his latest book, Alchemy, A Channeled Text, the Beyond the Known Trilogy, Book 2. To learn more about Paul Selig's work, please visit paulselig.com. On Instagram at paul.selig, and Facebook, that page is also paul.selig. Here comes the break. We'll be right back, and that is a promise.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
And we are back talking about dissolving division, taking a deep dive into consciousness and cosmology with my guest, Paul Selig. Let's get back to the conversation. So, Paul, prior to the break, you mentioned about what they say to you about lightness and darkness. And I would love for you to go back to that point and talk about the crossroads that we are at as humanity.
Well, when they talk about this stuff, they sometimes they speak in metaphors, sometimes they're just pretty direct. And as I said before the break, one of the things they teach incessantly is you cannot be the light and hold another in darkness. Yeah. And they say what you damn or who you damn damns you back. And that's about energy, and that's about consciousness. So put it this way, they say who you put in darkness or what you put in darkness calls you to that darkness. That's how it works. So a lot of teachings that people know of forgiveness, say in Christianity and other religions, are really about releasing the tie to the self that wishes to attack and to harm and to do all those things. So you understand the idea, that when you're choosing not to forgive somebody, you're the only one getting hurt, really, finally. You can carry a grudge for 20 years. I've done it. And it's harmful,
yes.
It stinks. So they're doing some of that work, but they are speaking a lot about humanity at a crossroads. And they've been doing this from the beginning. In the first book, I Am the Word, and I was just thinking about this the other day, because they rarely speak to the country, the U.S., but in that book they did. And they talked about the need for us as a civilization to become far more invested in being a model for great change than it was to be a dominator on the world stage. And that was interesting, but because they said humanity is at a time of reckoning. And a reckoning is a facing of the self and all of its creations. And they've said, how did they say this? Oh, yeah, basically everything that's been created in darkness or fear, in other words, has to be re-seen and re-known in a higher way. And, they've been talking in the last books, maybe the last 4 of them, quite a bit about the changes that we might be experiencing, which is radical change in economic structures, political structures, all this stuff. But they say, again, nothing really gets healed until it's seen for what it is. And that process of seeing, and this would be seeing how we treat each other, I suspect, as much as anything else, how we harm one another, how we deny the light in others. That's not an easy process. The interesting thing, when the guides I work with talk about manifestation, they're not talking about how to manifest a swimming pool necessarily. That's not their stuff. I sometimes wish it was, but that's not the primary way that they teach. But they talk about energetic accord, and they say ACCORD or ACHORD is on a piano. And they say everything that you see or can witness or even imagine, you are in vibrational accord to. And that includes the stuff that you can't stand. Now, what it means to be in vibrational accord is that your consciousness is informing what you see. So that goes to the idea of what you damn damns you back.
Yeah.
So you see, because that's the level of acclamation or vibrational accord that you're choosing to align to. The guides talk about lifting things to what they call the upper room. They say, you can't lift the evil man to the upper room because you've made him evil. And in doing that, you're actually aligning to him through the negative, and you're lowering your own vibration at that level. So the thing to do is, they talk about this a lot in the book, is lifting to what they call the upper room, which is a level of consciousness that's operating without fear. And from that place, you can lift because you can re-see or re-know things as what they would say is of source. They say that the biggest problem humanity faces is what they call the denial of the divine. And that has nothing to do with religion at all. It's the inherent holiness in everyone, the spark of the divine that must exist, even when it doesn't seem like that's even possible. And they say because we've been acting on the denial of the divine, which is refuting source, we've claimed separation against ourselves and against our fellows and against other countries. And, they say if we want to learn through blowing ourselves up to kingdom come, we can do that. They don't even seem to judge the choice. I don't hear that we're going to. But, if we want to learn the foolishness of war through blowing ourselves up, we can do that. This is all an opportunity to learn. That's what an incarnation offers. But there are other ways of being. And I suspect that what they're talking about now is about how we choose and how we choose to stop, for lack of a better word, or lift above the old paradigms of separation. We're seeing a lot of it now in the world. Us versus them. It's all separation. And, the purpose of, I hear of fear is to claim separation. That's what it does. The guides say things like the act of fear is to claim more fear, and every choice we make in fear gets us more of the same. And if you look at your life, you'll probably see that that's been true. They also say there's never been a lie told that wasn't told in fear. And I believe that to be true as well. So we have great opportunity, but we have to take it.
Well, and when we are in fear, it invites the surrender of self and our power.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, that is where humanity is at the moment. Mm-hmm. We're operating from that low vibration of fear. What's going to happen? Is it going to be okay?
Yeah.
And most of us have it. Regardless of what your beliefs are, we're at that very crossroads at this moment in time.
Yeah, we are. And that's got to be seen, I feel, as opportunity. The guides. Yes. I lecture online a lot. I mean, I'm channeling a lot these days, and the guides have been saying, this is a great opportunity to. But how we sort of get through this time will be really how we frame our experience. This is an opportunity to grow and to know ourselves in different ways and to I'm going to say, I wasn't going to say find a way, but accept a higher way, perhaps, than we've been given prior. And we can do this, but we have to choose it. We have free will. That's not been taken from us. And, how we attend to each other in these times, I think, is going to probably predicate the outcome of how things go for us. I do have hope because the guides keep saying reframe what you're frightened of as opportunity and you're going to be okay with it. That doesn't mean passively accepting it necessarily, but it does mean understanding your relationship to it because, again, how one holds anything in consciousness informs your relationship to the thing. So, I mean, imagine somebody new moves into the neighborhood and the person next door says, stay away from her. She's going to do this, and then you do that. Your whole relationship has shifted, through that. And you've basically put somebody in darkness, and now you're attached to them through that, what is possibly a false belief about who the other person is.
I'm sorry, I cut you off, and I didn't mean to do that.
It's fine.
I was going to just mention the necessity to muster courage. Because to me, that's part of the antidote as well.
Absolutely.
It's that risk taking, that sort of being willing to step to the other side or paint outside the lines just enough to investigate.
Well, we have to know that there are other possibilities. And unless we do that and step out of our comfort zone, we're never going to find it. The guides that I work with say, the small self knows itself through history. The true self knows itself in the eternal now. It is not operating from that same structure. So the guides say we're always getting what we expect, at a certain level, So we all have these frames that we walk around with. If my frame is people aren't trustworthy, I'm going to continue to manifest that.
That's the experience. That becomes our experience. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. I mean, as always, I find the visits that we have together to be insightful and affirming. For me that, there's no woo woo. I mean, to me, as you talk, it makes sense. For some people out there, they're going to say they, who is the they. The point is there's something more than we can see. And if we don't have any reverence for that or the sacred or the divine at all, then really what's left?
I agree. I was a hard sell with this stuff given my upbringing, but I think that there was an innate hunger for more or for a spiritual life that had no language given to it because I didn't know that I was allowed to have it. And I think if I do anything in my work, it's maybe perhaps give people permission, that you can know the world in a slightly different way. My guides are the teachers, but the opportunities, I think, that come, in times of great pain and great trial are enormous. And I think right now we're in one of those places collectively, which is also holds potentially great promise for all of us, for humanity, to know ourselves perhaps in a different way and hopefully with some more compassion for others.
We'll just say that as a blessing for everyone, for peace and goodwill and compassion and empathy and all the things that are required to move to a higher place. Paul Selig, thank you for joining us. The book we've been speaking about is Alchemy, a Channeled Text, the Beyond the Known Trilogy, Book 2. My guest has been Paul Selig. To learn more about Paul's work, please visit paulselig.com, on Instagram at paul.selig, and on Facebook, that handle is the same, paul.selig. Paul, come back anytime and share the wisdom that comes through you and just your beautiful presence.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And here comes a brief pause. We'll be right back, and that's a promise.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
We are back talking about dissolving division, taking a deep dive into consciousness and cosmology. My next guest is Professor Ervin Laszlo. He is a prolific author, and he's been twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's written a new book. He's written several books, and I would love for him to talk a little bit about the gamut of his writing experience. The book we're speaking of is Reconnecting to Source, the New Science of Spiritual Experience, How It Can Change You, and How It Can Transform the World. Professor Laszlo has also had appointments at Yale and Princeton. He's been a professor of philosophy, systems sciences, and future sciences at several universities around the world. And I'm super excited to have him here with me today. Welcome, Professor Laszlo. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Well, Liza, wonderful to be here. Do call me Irvin. Then we can chat nicely.
We can definitely chat nicely. And I want to say that Irvin is coming to us from Budapest, Hungary today. He is the president of, tell us the club that you have founded and you are president of in Budapest.
Well, it's called the Club of Budapest. In the 1970s, was a famous initiative called the Club of Rome, which then published a book called The Limits to Growth, which was, I think, the first serious book that said you can't just keep growing and expect everything will work out. There are limits to what you can, certainly to the kind of growth that we'll be doing, this kind of quantitative growth kind of growth. And so the Club of Rome was founded then. I was a member. And then after that, some 10 years or 15 years after the founding of the Club of Rome, I founded the Club of Budapest because I wanted to get into the dialogue, not just business people like the Club of Rome and political leaders. I also wanted to get people from the arts and from the spiritual domain and from civil society altogether. So that became then the Club of Budapest with the initial members, the Dalai Lama, Liv Ullmann, Peter Ustinov, and Yehudi Menuhin. Those were the first members.
Wow, that's quite an auspicious membership.
And so we now have about 50 members, big names, but obviously there's some change. Some of them are no longer with us, and some new ones are coming to it. But we are going to have some big meetings just here now in Budapest in a couple of days on the experience, on the after-death experience of having this Harvard neurosurgeon as a guest, Ervin Alexander, who had this fantastic experience while he was 7 days in a coma. He had experienced very acutely his surroundings.
It's interesting. Ervin Alexander has been a guest on the show. And for those of you who are interested in this topic, you should head on over to Harvesting Happiness Talk Radio and enter his name in the search bar so you can listen to a little bit more about that experience.
We are going to have a meeting in a couple of days with the guest, Ervin Alexander, the Harvard neurosurgeon, who had a fantastic near-death experience. While he was in coma, he had complete knowledge and recognition of people and surroundings and deep insights. He can tell you about that. He has written several books, I think 3 books by now, and he has many different shows. So, but the reason is that I'm in Budapest just now because we're having this meeting coming up. And the Club of Budapest, which has about 50 honorary members, big name people, and is present now in 24 countries, 24 clubs of Budapest in different parts of the world. And I have to sort of administer it. I am the founder, and I'm responsible for the direction it's taken. So that's the story on that.
So let's talk a little bit about quantum science and the intersection between science and spirituality, if there really is one.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you call this show quantum science and consciousness, because there's a lot in common. Quantum science and consciousness has in common a witty saying by some quantum physicists, or actually one particular, who said that anybody who says he understands quantum science is either a liar or he's naive. And I think we can say the same thing about consciousness. Anybody who thinks that he really understands consciousness is not telling the truth, or he is just very beguiled by simple things. Both of them are mysterious, but very, very important topics.
Let's talk a little bit about what it means to be conscious, because we think we know what it means to be awake and aware, but the quantumness of this consciousness, I think nobody really can get their head around or their arms around.
Well, where the link comes in with consciousness and quantum physics, the quantum physics shows that there are no absolute boundaries. All things are embedded in what we could consider a universal information field, a quantum field, and everything originates there. And so when you address one topic, one thought, one memory, in a way it's connecting with all other things. There are no absolute separations, no boundaries, and neither between body and mind. It's all in a large quantum sphere, a quantum universe. And that's the idea behind it. That's what we are finding. That's what quantum scientists, researchers are finding, that you can't break off any part of this experience, which we now get to through the new instruments of the modern sciences, contemporary sciences, far and wide into the universe, deep down into the microcosm, and increasingly investigating the observable elements of consciousness, such as the waves that the brain produces, the EEG patterns, and the various elements that we have that comes through in a deep, sometimes psychedelic, sometimes just meditative or other states of consciousness. It's a new field. A lot of inroads are being made, but it just shows that consciousness is one and the quantum universe is one. And that somehow we have to be able to put that together.
So I think from what I hear you saying, there is a disconnect between how most of humanity leads their lives. You know, the belief that what I do is my own business and there's no cause and effect to the other. And what I hear you saying is that they're inextricably linked. What I do absolutely reflects and influences you and everybody else on the planet and vice versa.
That is exactly the message that we are getting from the cutting edge of the sciences. Yes, there are no boundaries. And another thing I should say is this concept of information. You think of information as being artificial intelligence or collective intelligence or something that are messages or whatnot. And so that's something that we produce, perhaps on person or perhaps through the internet. But information is something that is basic to the universe. I think it is fair to say, and I've been saying so in my publications, when you come real down to it, what science tells you about what is the universe, what is reality, you can take out of that running, of that possibility, take out the concept of matter. Matter, as the great physicist Max Planck said, doesn't exist as such. Now, modern contemporary science says there is no such thing as matter. It's not matter that is there. So what is there? I would say information. And information is obviously carried by something, and we can say information is carried by energy. Can there be energy without matter? I think the quantum sciences will tell you yes. Energy and information are fundamental. We could even define a living being as a cluster, a system of informed energy. So it's a very, very different concept. And consciousness is also an element of information. After all, consciousness, the way it appears to us, is something that is going on in our head, in our brain, and we believe that it reflects something that goes on in the world at large. And that something is information and energy. So really we are coming down to this question, how can we think of consciousness and quantum science in a way that they are related? I think they are practically the same thing because both are based on information. The world is based on information, and consciousness is a cluster of information on a different level, in a different form, obviously. But we don't have that strict division, that enormous cutoff point, which is, and this is material and this is not. Material or spiritual, matter or mind. I think what it basically is occurring, what is taking place and what is real is something that used to be called spiritual and now we can call a quantum domain, a quantum sphere. It's the universe speaking to us.
I just am making a note here about the quantum domain, because I think when you break it down the way you've just described, it makes perfect sense. And there is no difference. There is no boundary. They are one and the same. And when we speak of being in a state of consciousness, it is this informed, energetic state of awareness.
It is, absolutely. We are reaching a point where that information that is all around us and that we are receiving, because we are receivers, after all, of information on many, many channels, many different ways, and our sense organs are just a few among them, the 5 of these organs, among the many ways that we can receive information. And that means that we are all receivers, and we are all one, can be one, and can be aligned with what we are receiving. And that's the great advantage, the great promise, I think, of quantum science, and the practical advantage, the practical promise, and of consciousness studies. It tells us what the world is like, and it helps us, allows us to be one with it, or to be aligned with it.
And I would say that the potential salvation of humanity, because if we begin to truly understand that we are not separate from our neighbor, that we may take better care of ourselves and the planet as a result.
Well, either you are quoting from my book, or it's a very happy coincidence that you came to the same conclusion that I have. Namely, this was reconnecting to the source, which for me the source is this deep information field, which is both the universe and the cosmic consciousness. And reconnecting to that, we lost that connection in the everyday world, in the Western world, and to reconnecting to that could be our salvation. And that's my motto. That's the closing sentence, practically, of my new book.
And the book we're speaking about today is by Professor Ervin Laszlo, entitled Reconnecting to the Source, The New Science of Spiritual Experience, How It Can Change You and How It Can Transform the World. We are going to take a brief pause to learn more about the work of Ervin Laszlo. Please visit his website, irvinlaszlo.com, on Twitter at Ervin Laszlo, and on Facebook you can find him at the page Club Budapest International. And on YouTube, there is a collection of beautiful videos that really articulate the subject matter that we're speaking about today. That channel is the Club of Budapest. Here comes the break. We'll be right back. And that is a guarantee.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life. A boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit harvestinghappiness.com to learn more.
What is your happiness?
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, we're talking about dissolving division, taking a deep dive into consciousness and cosmology. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest, Professor Ervin Laszlo. So, Irvin, during the pause, we were talking, just you and I, about the nature of this consciousness as a way to preserve the world, in the sense that if we keep going on the trajectory upon which we are rolling right now, it could potentially lead us to extinction. However, the flip side is these points that you are speaking of. Talk a little bit about how the book addresses this.
Well, there is a very key point that is often disregarded, at least in the general public. Namely, that's what we are finding out now, looking deeper and deeper into the universe and into life, the domain of life, into all things that change, and that the change is not haphazard. It's not random. There is something that is in charge of the change, a conductor, like in the sense of a musical conductor, of an orchestral conductor. There is something behind it. You can call it God, you can call it the Tao, or the Great Spirit, or whatever, or Yahweh, or whatever. But the universe has information that is a directional information. That means that it favors certain directions, certain ways of proceeding over others. To put it in terms that will be acceptable to scientists, we can say that the interactions that take place in the universe are not purely casual, are not purely random. There is a preferred direction to these interactions. And that interaction moves us closer and closer to a whole, to a systemic, to a wholeness in which all things are working together. And this is the case already after the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, they say, when the first quarks and then the quanta began to interact. And, they didn't just form gases, didn't form heaps and random aggregates. They started to form nuclei. The nuclei became nuclei of atoms when they captured the electrons, and the atoms became interacted with one another through the valence, and then became more and more complex, became molecules and crystals. The molecules in time became macromolecules, and they developed some of them and the functions of living beings, which is reproduction and self-governance or self-sustainability. So all this, to put a very, very long, 13.8 billion year old story, to make it short, we would say that there is something that holds the world together and that creates this kind of a comprehensible, coherent wholeness in the world, which is what we are. All life is that. The biosphere is that. The galaxy is that. So there is nothing purely random. Just as we said, there is nothing purely separate in the universe, and there's no such thing as passive, inert matter. Everything is moving, everything is interacting, and this interaction is dynamic and is directional. And now, just to bring this to the point that I want to make, if we find out something more about the direction, the way that it's going, then we can align ourselves with it. And then we are doing that famous thing that all science fiction is talking about, following the wave, going with the source, or finding the source, and following the way things unfold, being a part of evolution, a positive part, and not an indifferent part or a negative part, perhaps. That, I think, is the true satisfaction that we can have in life, that I think is true happiness, a source of it. And that is perhaps, as you say, the salvation, because then we can become one with that direction, that tremendous wave, which is non-linear, which is complex, which is often interrupted, but it always goes on. It's a wave that conduces toward wholeness, and which is, by the way, just to use this famous four-letter word that nowadays we're using more and more, which is love. Yeah. There is this kind of a tropism, this kind of a directionality. When you move into it and your deep levels of consciousness, you feel it as a sensation of love, universal love, unconditional love. I call it evolutionary love. I think that is the key to how we can reconnect to the source, become more loving beings, because the universe is a loving universe.
I agree with everything you have just shared. And then as you're speaking, I think to myself, is the negative influence or the disruptive energy actually a requirement to calibrate and redirect our awareness to this place of love, that love is the answer? Does it, that the contrast heightens the awareness of what's needed?
We certainly have plenty of contrast.
Yes. Not always helpful, but it's there.
But there is also such a thing, as we know now from the experience with evolution and the biosphere, evolution on all its levels. There is no real change until there is a kind of a crisis, until there's a tipping point, until there is a challenge. And this is what we are getting. We are being promoted into a push toward, into a new mode of existence, which is more aligned with the universe. Because our current state of the past 250 years is not the right one. I mean, it's not aligned. It's a very selfish, self-centered state, which might be good for short-term satisfaction, but on the long term, it destroys the whole system in which we live. And we're beginning to experience this. We call it climate change. We call it the refugee crisis or whatever. These are all symptoms of not being coherent, not being loving, as it were, not being one with each other, but trying to only promote one thing, ourselves, our short-term immediate interests. And that is now reacting. It's feeding back to us, and we find the negative consequences. And that's the contrast that you're talking about. We are getting plenty of that.
Yes, but it's a requirement almost in order to catalyze the shift.
It is. We will always be standing still practically. But there is no standing still. There's no way to do that. Then we would be going down the hill. We are already beginning to go down in certain respects. But what we need is to understand that the crisis that we are living through is a portal, is an opening for a more consistent, more coherent, and more belongingness or oneness kind of a future. And that is there, I think, in the new cultures, in the youth cultures. But we have to take it. It's there in all spiritual people. We have to take it seriously. It's not just imagination. It's there in the universe.
I want to just add a little something about your book, Reconnecting to the Source. The foreword was written by Deepak Chopra. There's a commentary by Neil Donald Walsh. There are several contributions. You call it the bouquet of spiritual experiences, plural, by several luminaries. I mean, I'm going to just name a couple, and then maybe you can jump on and add to that. Jane Goodall, Barbara Marx Hubbard, Jean Houston, Dean Radin, some great thinkers of our time really speak to what you are sharing in depth and from a very personal perspective.
Well, I am trying to show what I feel deep down, and that in my research also find more and more sustained and substantiated, is this movement toward wholeness expressed in love. And so I ask people that I'm convinced are both sensitive and honest people, sincere, ethical people, and have this great sensitivity to the world and to each other and to themselves. I ask them to describe any experiences that they had which came spontaneously and had such an effect that they could say that it just changed their life. It turns out that every one of the people whom I asked had such experiences. And I said, okay, would you share that? Most people don't talk about these experiences because they feel it's too private, or perhaps they won't be taken seriously, or even they think that they themselves are not serious, which would be a serious thing in itself for a philosopher and for a scientist. But they sat down. Actually, I think they were quite happy to be able to talk about it. And you know what came out? Even though it was a very different ways and very different stories behind it, but the end result was always that then they realized in this flash practically of insight, realized that yes, we belong. We are part of one. We belong to the world. And what we do affects everything, and everything affects us. And together we can move forward, or we can break down. But the real possibility of, through the sensation of being aligned with the motivation, with the drive that is behind in evolution, that we can, if we do that, then we are aligned, we are a positive part, and then we are one in a way that only the poets have been talking about up till now. Now, with the new quantum science, we can tell that we can really be one because we are inherently one. We just have to recognize it.
Oh. And this is where the great hopefulness resides to me. The older I get, the more I realize, yes, that we are just one. We're not separate. Your joy and your suffering are not really disconnected from mine or anybody else's. And that gives me comfort and hope, I think.
Well, that's it. You come to that conclusion because you are reaching that level of consciousness evolution, which we really need. If that kind of consciousness would evolve in a critical mass around us, then I think we would find a way to handle the problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's poverty, whether it's deterioration of the environment, or the corruption in politics, or whatever the problems, and there are plenty of them. We could handle them because we could interact with one another, and we could create a new and more basic, more fundamental way of coming forth, a new mentality. By the way, I use a term for that which is getting used a great deal by everybody. It originates with Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher of science, 50 or so years ago. It's called paradigm. We are entering into a new paradigm, a fundamentally new way of conceiving of the world, conceiving of us, and of acting in the world. And that, I think, is essential, that we absorb and we became one with that, or use that new paradigm as the oneness, as the key to oneness for us.
My guest today has been Professor Ervin Laszlo. We're speaking about his new book, Reconnecting to the Source, the New Science of Spiritual Experience, How It Can Change You and How It Can Transform the World. To learn more, please visit irvinlaszlo.com, on Twitter at Ervin Laszlo, on Facebook, the page is Club Budapest International, and on YouTube, the channel that is chock-a-block with wonderful videos is the Club of Budapest. Ervin's going to come back and speak with us in a few months. He's got a new book that he's also working on that we are going to support. Maybe you can give us a little hint and highlight of that, Ervin.
Well, I'm going to use a term that has been used by Barbara Marx Hubbard, who indeed will be a co-author of this, even though she passed a few months ago. She wanted to be a co-author with me on the new book, and we are doing that using her materials. And that key concept is love, but of a certain kind, a particular kind, evolutionary, universal love. That is what I've been talking about with you, chatting now, and that is what will be the central topic of my new book as well.
Thanks, Ervin. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Lisa. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen and my guests, Paul Selig and Professor Ervin Laszlo, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Go out and rock your day.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen. Harvesting Happiness is produced in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.